I want to introduce Ben Furnas, who agreed to be tonight's speaker. He was born and raised in Ithaca and is a 2006 graduate of Cornell University when he received a Bachelor of Arts degree after doing a double major in government and also in economics. He also has a law degree from New York University. He served as the director of the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate and Sustainability, where he collaborated with partners inside and outside of government to spearhead nation-leading initiatives to decarbonize the city's buildings, develop renewable energy, embrace sustainable transportation, and reduce the climate impact of municipal operations, as well as advancing environmental justice. Ben became executive director of the 2030 Project, a Cornell climate initiative, in February 2022. This project was launched in May of 2022 and is mobilizing faculty to develop and accelerate tangible solutions to a warming world. At tonight's meeting, Ben will speak about his experience in New York City, what work is being done at the state level, some of the research that people at Cornell University are working on, and some insights on how climate change is already impacting New York State, including agricultural impacts. And following his short presentation, I encourage you to engage in questions, comments that you have, concerns, worries, anything that you can think of. And I want to, with that, thank Ben for joining us and thank him as well as his colleagues and people that are helping to work to save a habitable climate. So welcome, Ben, and again, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Valdi. That was a really nice introduction. And as Valdi said, I grew up in Ithaca, and so a lot of participating in this. And as I was growing up and in my sort of early adulthood, a lot of the fights and conversations around hydraulic fracturing and natural gas extraction in the state of New York, and I'm sure folks in this group were leading the charge on a lot of that great work. And it's really nice to see such an engaged group of folks thinking about these really important issues at this critical time. So I have some slides I thought it would be useful to go through just to sort of frame out our conversation. I'm sure a lot of folks on this call have deep expertise in a lot of these issues, but for the sake of talking a bit about what's happening in New York State right now, how folks at the state level are thinking about taking action on climate, framed a little bit about the work that I did during my 8 years in the New York City Mayor's Office, and then talk a bit about what's happening now at Cornell University with the 2030 Project, which we're quite excited about. So, let's see. So, first, I always like to sort of go back to the sources of greenhouse gas emissions. Obviously, the major goal of a lot of work when we think about addressing climate change is to dramatically reduce the greenhouse gases that are going into the atmosphere from all of the human activity that is contributing to the challenge. And in New York State, pretty substantially, a large share of our emissions are coming from the fossil fuels used to heat, cool, and power our buildings, from the gas in our cars, the methane emissions from our waste, some of our industrial processes, and some in the agriculture emissions from livestock and other agricultural activities. And if you sort of see over time, you can sort of see in New York State has been making very modest but not non-zero progress on reducing a lot of these emissions, largely from shifting away from oil and coal power plants and towards natural gas, actually, but also you sort of see building out renewables and improvements in fuel efficiency, and starting to get our arms around reducing emissions from transportation. As Valdi talked about, and as I'm sure everyone here knows, New York State passed one of the more ambitious state level climate laws in the country in 2019. A lot of major goals in each of the major categories of emissions, and set up a structure called the Climate Action Councils as part of the CLCPA to develop more detailed plans that has now sort of culminated in a set of legislative and regulatory recommendations and a whole lot of programs that need funding and resources in order to really accelerate and take the next step, which is what a lot of the conversations in this session in Albany are all about. And so I'm happy to talk a lot more about that later on in the presentation. We sort of see really the ambitious goals associated with the CLCPA and in the form of these targets. So, you sort of seeing the slow reduction in emissions, but the next 10, 20, 30 years are, I would say it's really game time, right? If we're really going to be on track to meet these dramatic emission reductions that, the international community and the scientific consensus suggests are really necessary to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, pretty rapid decarbonization is needed. So in the city, as Valdi mentioned, I spent 8 years in the New York City Mayor's office, culminating as the director of the Office of Climate and Sustainability. We focused a fair bit on the emissions associated with our buildings. Because New York City residents disproportionately get around on my favorite electric vehicle, which is the New York City subway system, our transportation emissions are sort of proportionately lower than lots of other places, not because our cars are cleaner, but just because fewer of us own cars and take a lot of the trips around the city in cars. And so when it comes to municipal government taking action, both the problem, meaning the sources of emissions that we were grappling with, and a lot of the tools that we had available to us through the building code and local regulatory and legislative authority to make changes in our buildings, meant that we spent a fair bit of time focused on that source of emissions in the city. Right, this map makes that the point on transportation. You sort of see this is a carbon dioxide emissions from transportation by county, and you can sort of see places where a lot of folks are taking transit for a lot of their trips, represented in the green counties, and counties where folks either by choice or by necessity are doing a lot more driving. They tend to they just have more emissions associated with their vehicles, and so decarbonizing those communities tends to be more of a electrification of those vehicles or shifting towards land use patterns that mean that people don't have to take so many trips in the car if they don't have to. So just as by sort of mapping out a little bit of what our goals look like, this is from the International Energy Agency. It was a report that came out in 2019, right on the cusp of when we were passing some of our major pieces of building related legislation. They put out this report that showed the quote narrow but achievable path to net zero by 2050, which is sort of the consensus goal that a lot of folks are working towards. And specifically, they talked about calling for, by 2025, limiting the sale of new fossil fuel boilers for heating. And by 2030, all new buildings should be zero carbon ready, which usually means electric buildings. So as your grid gets clean and more of the electricity is generated from cleaner renewable sources, your buildings are just, because they're entirely electrified, that they are as low emissions as your grid ends up being. So with that as sort of our goal, right, by 2040 and 2050, the International Energy Agency identified a real need to be doing a lot of retrofitting and transforming of existing buildings too, which is a much higher level of difficulty than focusing on brand new buildings, but is still really critical work. So in the city, the challenge associated with building decarbonization was a little bit distinct for different categories of buildings. So in residential buildings, largely because this is where we cook and shower and spend cold nights, our gas usage tends to be higher than our electricity usage. And in commercial and institutional buildings where we, particularly pre-pandemic, where there was a lot more office work happening, that's where a larger share of their energy use came from electricity. Another way of looking at this in the same way is you sort of see space heating being a fairly substantial part of where we use our fossil fuels in our buildings, with water heating and cooking taking up water heating taking up another large chunk, but cooking, despite the sort of disproportionate focus on gas stoves versus electric stoves and the sort of culture war dynamics around that, it actually represents a pretty modest share of the greenhouse gases and the fossil fuels that are used in our buildings, with the just giant in this space really being about how we heat and keep our homes and office buildings comfortable, and figuring out how to shift away from fossil fuels for those uses is sort of the whole ballgame. So, the tool that we used to focus on existing buildings and reducing, we called Local Law 97. This was passed in 2018, and it set efficiency and energy use targets for the largest buildings in New York City. So buildings 50,000 square feet and above. You can sort of think of that as a 50-unit apartment building. It's sort of roughly 1,000 square feet per apartment building. So these are really substantial, large buildings. It's interesting because it's not so many buildings by count, but it's actually about 50% of the built square footage in New York City. So it's a huge share of the amount of indoor space that exists in the city. And the way the law works is it requires buildings to hit progressively tighter emission limits. The first one is coming up just next year, where the worst performing efficiency buildings will have to reduce their emissions to meet this 2024 limit. So what this graph on the right shows is that about 20% of properties are currently, either because they have dirty boilers or because they are using they have really inefficient, leaky buildings. They have a much higher emissions per square foot than other types of buildings in their use class. And so the 2024 limit is designed to spur retrofits, electrification, efficiency improvements in these buildings to reduce emissions. And then the 2030 limit is much tighter, and it is really designed to make large buildings sort of best in class, highly efficient buildings by subjecting them to fines and penalties in proportion to how much they exceed their emissions limits. Another major piece of legislation that I was particularly involved in right at the end of my tenure, we passed in 2021, Local Law 154, which requires that new buildings in the city of New York be all electric buildings. This is sort of on a timeline and has formed the model for what state legislators are now considering taking statewide, to require that when we construct a new building our law was in the city of New York, that it has to be all electric for heating and for cooking. So we had sort of a phased in timeline of smaller buildings requiring to be all electric by 2024, and by the middle of 2027, the overwhelming share of larger buildings as well. We're already seeing a lot of large developments in New York get ahead of this. We're seeing large buildings coming online that are all electric just this year. So it's really setting the pace for development in the city, and it's nice because it means that as we grow, we're not locking in brand new fossil fuel infrastructure that will have to be retrofit or changed in the next 10, 20, 30 years. We're sort of growing in a way that is sustainable for the medium and long term. That this was passed with some amount of fanfare, and I do think it sort of set a new standard for large four-season cities, that this can be something that is done and can be embraced. A lot of the jurisdictions that passed laws like this before New York were in California, where to put it plainly, they just don't have winter. So the notion that they wouldn't use fossil fuels in the wintertime was a much sort of lower level of difficulty. But we felt very comfortable with the direction that the heat pump industry was going, the capabilities associated with electric heat technologies far better than the sort of earlier versions of non-induction or not heat pump electric heating. It's far more efficient, and we felt very comfortable even on a cost competitive basis that these timelines were thoughtful, and particularly as we're talking about new construction, that this would really be a shift that made sense. Another thing that has happened recently that I think has really supercharged a lot of these conversations is the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. I think that the bottom line is that there's just huge amounts of new federal resources that are designed both to help individual homeowners make the shift to electric appliances and electric heating to shift away from fossil fuel use in their own homes. And I think with all these resources comes a really transformed market that, contractors will get much more familiar with dealing with heat pumps, because there's so much more money and interest going into the heat pump market. Heat pumps will get better and better. And we're sort of seeing that dynamic already, where the deepening of these markets and the options available for homeowners are sort of getting better and better for new buildings in particular, but even as we think about existing homeowners or existing building owners thinking about how to retrofit or electrify their buildings, even though that's obviously a more expensive and more logistically complicated dynamic than just starting from an all-electric building or building a brand new building. Another piece that we worked on pretty heavily in New York City is we thought a lot about how clean our electric grid is. We would talk a lot about the tale of two grids, where upstate, outside of Zone J, which is the area of the grid where New York City is, electricity is really quite clean. Large amounts of renewable electricity, large amounts of hydropower and zero carbon nuclear power means that the greenhouse gas emissions associated with electricity upstate is very modest. This green donut up here, 92% low or no carbon electricity. Downstate, it's a really different dynamic, and there's not a lot of transmission lines that connect these two parts of the grid. So there's a lot of excess clean electricity in upstate and Western New York, and there's a lot of dirty fossil fuel plants, particularly a lot of natural gas plants that are actually in the five boroughs, contributing to pretty dirty air in neighborhoods, particularly in Western Queens. So something that we work pretty closely with NYSERDA on, and I'm sure folks have heard some versions of this, are catalyzing the development of new transmission that would help to bring renewable electricity from upstate New York, catalyze new electricity generation, and then also a transmission line to Canadian hydropower and wind power that would help to offset some of the fossil fuel use that is used to generate electricity in the five boroughs. I think the reality of the closure of Indian Point, wherever you sort of stand on that issue, meant that the carbon intensity of the New York City grid went up a lot, and so trying to replace that zero carbon electricity with something that was also zero carbon or clean and renewable was something that we felt pretty strongly needing to get done. Another major piece that New York City and New York State and the federal government are working closely together is on the development and expansion of offshore wind, and having those projects move forward as quickly as we can. There was work that we could do on the city side to improve the possibilities of landing sites and places for them to connect into the five boroughs. But a lot of this work continues at the state level, and the state working in close consultation with the federal government to get these lease areas built out and to maximize the amount of renewable electricity that can come from offshore wind. As Valdi mentioned, a lot of obviously why we're doing this is we feel a real sense of threat associated with climate in New York State. And I don't like to be apocalyptic or overstate the concerns, but I do think that I think there's broad consensus on this call, at least, that stopping climate change and reducing their impacts is sort of a critical role for all levels of government and all areas of society in the next 10, 20, 30 years. And here in New York State, there's been a lot of analysis, and it continues, on what climate change will mean for our state and our region. An ongoing process that a lot of Cornell professors are actually currently involved in is working on the New York State Climate Impacts Assessment. Luis Aguirre Torres and a couple of professors, particularly working on the agriculture section. I think it's actually due out in the next couple of months. They're sort of finalizing a draft. But some things that we sort of see as likely impacts on New York State, and particularly and agriculture communities, are increase in extreme precipitation, short-term drought, heat stress that makes growing more challenging and makes it harder for workers who are working outside, and increased and shifted pest pressures associated with new weather patterns that brings new pests and challenges. Some research that was done a couple years ago, but was recently reinforced by some work at Cornell, found a 17% reduction in global agricultural productivity by 2050 associated with anthropogenic climate change. One thing to note, this is 70% lower than it would otherwise be. But this anticipates, and a lot of the bread and butter work that happens at Cornell is to improve baseline level of agricultural productivity growth and always be helping farmers get more and more productive using advanced and modern techniques and technologies. And so even as we say that 17%, would be 17% lower than it would otherwise be. That's lower than a baseline anticipated level of continued improvement in the way we grow our food and get our food. To that end, just a little bit about the 2030 project and what we're working on at Cornell. This is a project that is it's university wide, although I'm sort of housed at the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability, which is a sustainability center at Cornell University. I think a key distinguishing characteristic of what we're doing at Cornell is sort of emphatically not creating a new school or department dedicated only to climate. I think something that a lot of other higher education or American research institutions have been doing a sort of reorganization, creating a new school. That's not really what Cornell's strategy is. The vision is to really be a university-wide mobilization to support impact-oriented climate work that's happening across all of the different colleges, regardless of discipline, and sort of attracting and directing resources and supporting ambitious work that's happening all across the university. So we have some sort of thematic highlights, areas that we're particularly focusing on, places where we think Cornell has distinctive strengths. One is really the food and farms of the future. So thinking about the future of our agricultural production system, both from the point of view of how it can be preparing farmers and agricultural communities for the realities of a warming world, reducing the emissions impacts associated with particular types of agricultural uses, particularly livestock methane emissions in our dairy industry. And also thinking about ways in which farms can be sources of solutions. So thinking about ways to improve the carbon content of soil, or Valdi was mentioning agroforestry, of thinking about using agricultural lands in a way that on net removes greenhouse gases or supports different types of sequestration or negative emissions. The other is thinking about energy of the future. So a lot of folks are thinking about batteries and renewable energy technologies. One place where we really see Cornell as having a distinctive strength is, we obviously have a world-class engineering school, a world-class chemistry department in the College of Arts and Sciences. But we also have a lot of people thinking about how energy systems affect the places where they are, or the ecosystems where they exist. So thinking about these challenges of, siting wind and solar farms on land that might otherwise be used for agricultural uses, or as we think about all of the renewable electricity that needs to be built, think about doing it in a thoughtful way that is consistent with also protecting biodiversity and other types of uses that the land might otherwise be protected for or put a use to. We're also thinking a lot about materials. We have folks both in engineering and in chemistry, as I mentioned, that are thinking about industrial technologies, the way we develop, whether it's plastics or concrete or building materials, thinking about ways to both reduce the emissions associated with that, and again, think about ways to have it be either negative emissions or sort of circular economy dynamics to dramatically reduce the amount of emissions or impact associated with materials. And as we think about material needs for our new energy system, whether it's batteries or solar panels, there's huge questions about the extraction associated with whether it's lithium or copper or minerals associated with that new energy system, and thinking about how to do it and get those resources that we need in a thoughtful way while minimizing environmental impacts. And finally, we sort of think about societies of the future as the name of the theme, but it's sort of how we can be supporting policies at different levels of government, business decisions, and movements. So, groups like this one and other types of advocacy or organizations, how can we be arming them with the best available information and knowledge to help support thoughtful policy or practice changes? One of the first things we did was set up a set of FAST grants to support teams across the entire university. We ended up funding about 17 teams working on different categories of problems. Received more than 50 applications across the entire university. Everything from carbon capture, improving the efficiency of solar panels, reducing emissions from cattle and livestock, new textiles for cooling and energy efficiency. Really thoughtful work at the School of Industrial and Labor Relations about working with auto workers and navigating the transition from fossil fuel vehicles to electric vehicles. And we're really just getting started with a lot of that work. And so there'll be more to come as different teams at Cornell sort of think about ways to be mobilizing to support this really challenging problem at this really important time. So with that, I'm really happy to open it up and gossip, talk, answer questions, bemoan our legislative leaders. Anything you want to do?
Since you're familiar with New York City's efforts, and you did point out the difference between upstate New York and the city.
Yeah.
So they have a lot more dirty fuel down there.
Yeah.
Gas plants.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, how are the gas lines and gas plants in the city going to be addressed in the next 10 years or so?
Yeah. So it's a great question. It's something we grappled with a lot. And I would make a distinction between, there's the natural gas that is currently burned for electricity. So that is used by the power plants to supply electricity to the city. And then there's the gas that, we all, or many of us, use that runs to our homes for our heating and cooking. I think on the power generation electricity side, the key strategy to reduce our dependence on those fossil fuel power plants has been the dramatic expansion of renewable electricity, new transmission lines, the offshore wind strategy. All of that is sort of designed to reduce the amount of fossil fuels, and natural gas in particular, we need to burn to generate the electricity that we need. The other question is sort of the future of the gas system is also an incredibly challenging one, and we sort of nibbled away at it by making sure that the next generation of buildings wouldn't be reliant on the natural gas system. And now thinking about ways to carefully shift people away from natural gas without leaving the remaining ratepayers who are still on the system left entirely holding the bag to maintain this increasingly outdated and I think we all have an ambition to make natural gas distribution systems a thing of the past, but it's definitely going to be a piece of infrastructure that we'll be navigating and phasing off of for years to come, even as we try to shift folks away from relying on it for heating and cooking as much as we can. So that's how we're sort of thinking about it. Saw something in the chat, or Jim, do you want to go, and then I'll answer Ed's question in the chat?
Yeah, thank you. You had a slide in the New York City section. I think it was called Electric New Buildings. And it showed this amazing structure that looked tall and almost wafer thin.
Yeah.
Do you know what that
I do.
is? Yeah.
So it's on Flatbush Avenue right here in Brooklyn. Even before it's being built by a development team from a company called Alloy Development. And they were incredible. So this was a sort of voluntary prototype project that was being built even in advance of the law that we passed. I'm going to get the address for you. It's on Flatbush Avenue. Yeah, well, it's 100 Flatbush, and you can read all about it. it's a terrific project. There's no fossil fuels on site at all. And it was a real proof of concept to show that not only is it possible, but it can be beautiful and quite lovely to have these sort of futuristic buildings. And it was a really, you know, as someone who grew up in Ithaca, like it was nice to be able to say this isn't like wild-eyed, crazy hippie stuff. Like this is thoughtful, ambitious, totally consistent with, you know, a growing metropolitan city. And I think a lot of the folks at REBNY, which is the major real estate lobbying entity in the city of New York, they ultimately were convinced that this was a doable dynamic, and these were technologies that were ready and that could be embraced. So it's a great project, and they were
Is
really.
that a residential building?
It's a
or
residential.
commercial? And it seemed like, from what I could see, that there was a hell of a lot of materials enclosing a very small amount of space.
Mm.
So from that standpoint, it seems not really in line with sustainability.
Yeah, I mean, no, the sort of question about embodied carbon and reducing reducing the embodied emissions in the building materials. I think that's sort of a next. I think there's been some amount of thinking on it, but I think it's like a sort of critical next phase in a lot of this work. Certainly for a lot of the larger developments, it's less that the development itself is particularly low emissions, but the counterfactual, where all these folks have detached mansions somewhere on Long Island and are driving everywhere and are using fossil fuels to heat their large homes. You know, it's better than that, but that's not to say that, you know, there's all sorts of really exciting things happening with mass timber and just dramatically being able to dramatically reduce embodied emissions and building materials also. And, you know, if I were still with the city, that would be my next goal, is to not just be reducing operational emissions through electrification, but also all the embodied emissions in the building materials that end up getting used also.
Yeah, and one more question. There was information on reducing the amount of emissions between now and 2050.
Yeah.
And it involved buildings and a lot of work on buildings. And were the emissions involved in making those building modifications included in that calculation?
There's always a sort of like baseline challenge in talking about what we mean when we are doing the retrofits, or when we're sort of assuming a level of population growth and economic growth, what course it sort of charts. I think the shortest answer to your question is no, it doesn't include that. But I think that the slightly longer answer is, I still think it's a valuable exercise. And, you know, I think there's sort of it just today, actually, Bill McKibben had a great piece in Mother Jones talking about like thinking about the climate challenge as a set of machines and systems that all sort of need to be replaced. And I think in that spirit, this was sort of how we think about sort of setting the right regulations in place to encourage and accelerate those transitions.
Okay,
I want to answer Ed's. Yeah, thanks, Jim. I want to answer Ed's question. What kind of storage is going to be associated with the offshore wind? Yeah, I mean, I think there is a parallel strategy to be dramatically expanding different types of energy storage across the state. I think you're very right and wise to be identifying this as a challenge with renewables. You know, even at the highest capacity overbuilt wind, there still will be times when, you know, the capacity fluctuates or the energy generated fluctuates, goes up and down. And so there's going to be a need to backfill that with something. I think in the short term, you'll sort of see the natural gas plants in New York City being used less frequently, but they'll still be ramping up and down, sort of tracing to sort of backfill electricity generation when the wind blows less strongly, even when offshore wind comes online. One of the appeals, and I am keenly aware of, the controversies and complexities associated with embracing hydropower, but one of the appeals from New York City's point of view, from building a transmission line to Canadian hydropower, was it's on and it's always on. The capacity factor is very high. So it sort of replaces natural gas 1-for-1, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, in a way that, solar energy certainly obviously has a daily cycle. And wind energy is just spikier and so requires a little bit more just gas to be waiting at the ready to be burnt to backfill that electricity. So, all of these questions have some tough trade-offs, but that's how we were thinking about it. And biochar, yeah. So there's a gentleman, Johannes Lehmann. I'm not sure if he's ever spoken with you, but he's totally terrific. He's Mr. Biochar. He does a lot of really exciting work, and there are folks working on it, and both as a something to do with organic waste, and also as a nutrient additive to be reducing emissions associated with agriculture and soil health.
Yeah, going back to the earlier discussion about what do we do about the existing gas pipelines, and especially within tightly built communities, even small cities, and certainly New York City. There was a bill passed to work on building district building heating loops. Is it possible to use some of the existing piping either by shoving in a sleeve, replacing valves and metering, pressure regulators, things like that, appropriately to help facilitate that, where you're using, I think, basically like an antifreeze and water mixture to transport ground heat around. Is that something that could be used?
Yeah, I'm familiar with that legislation that was passed, and one thing that I think it does well and is quite wise is that it empowers utilities to do a lot of this thinking. And as you sort of indicated, like, I think they are fairly well situated to think about what types of shifts make sense, as long as we get the sort of their incentives aligned properly. They right now provide heating services to many buildings. They have a billing mechanism. They have a highly trained unionized workforce that is used to digging in the streets and connecting into people's houses. Like, if anybody is well positioned to figure out, what other types of systems could be built either in parallel or using some aspects of the existing natural gas system, I think they're better positioned than anyone else to be thinking through that, as long as they sort of stop thinking of the energy transition as something that is a threat to their business, but instead see it as a potential new opportunity for their business. The difference in National Grid's posture towards our building electrification bill and Con Ed's was quite illustrative. Con Ed was much more open, and on some level that makes sense, because at least in the 5 boroughs, Con Ed sells both electricity and gas. So if you shift from gas to electricity, you're literally just shifting from one division of Con Ed to another, but they keep you as a customer. Whereas because National Grid only sells gas, it's a much more sort of existential threat if you just stop being a gas company customer. But because these utilities are so tightly regulated by the state, they have exactly as much profit as the Public Service Commission allows them to have. I think a thoughtful engagement by the Public Service Commission and sort of a clear-eyed charge from them to say, National Grid, you might have been in one business in the past, but you're going to be in a new business in the future, and we want to work with you to figure out how to transition your customers to still provide, high quality, affordable heat, but it's going to be a way to get it without that's not also contributing to climate change and doesn't rely on fossil fuels. So it's a tricky, it's an enormously challenging problem. I think it's one of the hardest problems in New York State climate policy right now is thinking about how to navigate the future of our gas system. And you hear a lot about like a death spiral where you have a set of customers who just get off the gas system altogether, and the remaining customers still need to maintain the whole network because, but it's a smaller and smaller number of people who are responsible for maintaining the same size network, and so prices just go up and up and up, and that's unfair and quite unjust for people who might not be able to afford to electrify their buildings. And so it's not a impossible problem, but it is a really tricky problem, and it requires pretty good faith engagement by utilities and legislators and the Public Service Commission and energy regulators.
I think there needs to be more messaging to the public and to elected officials, especially in lower levels of government, to warn people that this is going to become a problem.
Yeah.
So if you don't start taking advantage of the incentives that are going to be provided in the near-term future in the next 5-10 years, and you are stubborn and you wait until the very end of when you might be able to switch over to electrify your heating of your air as well as your water. In the meantime, you're going to be facing increasing costs, and you may really end up in big trouble.
Yeah.
So I hope that people start talking about this, because right now, the unfortunate thing is the people that want to maintain the status quo, they don't want to have this electrification of our economy. They are pushing scare tactics,
Yeah.
and spending huge amounts of money per week and pushing these nonsense messages constantly. And we need to have a campaign talking about the positives, and I don't see it anywhere near enough of that.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I do think, like, as you sort of indicated, the amount of resource that is coming from the Inflation Reduction Act, I think if states can get their ducks in a row and having these incentives flow out into individual homeowners, I hope that the cost questions and the politics shift at least a little bit at the margins in a more positive direction, because it's just a lower political lift to try to get some of this stuff done if it's less expensive or less intrusive than it is right now. And I think I hope there can be a sort of virtuous cycle that sets in before before some type of backlash, and I'm sure these things will swing back and forth a bit, but I think avoiding backlash is something that certainly kept us up at night. I mean, Andy, I see this question in the chat about the California ruling. Hi, Andy, nice to see you. This is a great question. So we thought a lot about this when I was sort of sitting in the hot seat trying to make a decision. One of the early decisions that we made, sort of because of that graph I showed about what a small fraction of greenhouse gas emissions actually come from cooking, that we were going to exempt restaurants for their cooking use from the gas ban in the city of New York, meaning they still have to have electric heating in all new restaurants, but for the purposes of cooking, everybody is sort of dealing with the politics that they have. I do think that there's both a political and a sort of substantive technological challenge about sort of going to war with the restaurant industry. And I think particularly over COVID, restaurants were totally battered and sort of heroes in a lot of sense. And so I think you sort of see the strength of the Restaurant Association and just the politics of why this ban was able to get struck down in California. I think another thing, just as sort of a technical matter, like our gas ban was not in fact a ban. It was a limit on fossil fuel combustion that could exist in a building. And we set the threshold so low that a boiler could not qualify, a stove could not qualify. So, on this narrow question of like preemption, I think we learned some lessons from the way other jurisdiction had passed. And there's a group of folks at the Sabin Center at Columbia University, Amy Turner, who's totally terrific, who guided us and helped inform a lot of the legal questions. My sense is that the particular law that we passed in New York State is much more insulated legally than this particular one was, because of the way we structured our our restriction on fossil fuel combustion in new buildings. But that blend of, thinking about the politics and what enemies you have and keep, who will spend tooth and nail to try to overturn and also try to put your law on the best legal footing you can, is sort of just the exercise of politics and policy that we're trying to do. I think the unpopularity thing is so real, and I think the only real durable way to navigate through is to have induction stoves be easy and appealing to use, and have heat pumps be comfortable and fine and not excessively expensive. I think there's no beating just having things being nicer. I think it's really hard to maintain people's enthusiasm about fighting climate change if your heat fritzes out or you can't cook the way you used to cook. Like, it's, I wish, I guess I wish that the love of fighting climate change were so durable that it could overcome mild frustrations or discomfort. But I just think, being realistic, it's so much easier to have all these conversations if you can say, hey, induction stoves are great, heat pumps are totally fine, it's less expensive, it's cleaner for your kids, and you won't regret making the switch. You won't think like, oh, these fucking environmentalists who made me do all this, now I can't even boil water or whatever it is, right? Like, it just feels like a more a more appealing way of living. That's sort of what we're all in the business of trying to do. Yeah. Targets. It's a huge amount, the solar build out. So the CLCPA has explicit written out numerical targets for solar megawatt capacity. I'm forgetting what they are right now, but they're quite substantial. My assessment of the public resistance to the installation of solar farms, I think it's quite real, and it's quite challenging. I think even among the best of folks concerned about climate change, when the reality hits and there's a grassy field that all of a sudden gets turned into a utility scale solar farm, I think it's tough for a lot of people. It's sort of ironically, I think, even particularly among people who think of themselves as environmentalists, part of the reason we're all environmentalists is because we love the look of natural, beautiful vistas and spaces, and sort of seeing things that look like machines on hills can be sort of tough, even as we're thinking about reducing climate change. One of the things I've been interested in, the work that's happening at Cornell, and Baldy, we were talking a little bit about this earlier, is like thinking about more thoughtful ways of doing solar development. So co-locating certain types of agricultural uses, developing the solar arrays in a way that can encourage ecosystem benefits or services. There's some folks who are thinking a lot about like pollinators in and among solar fields, so you can sort of have like butterflies and bees sort of buzzing around. So ways of being a little bit more thoughtful than just a sort of sterile, cleared utility scale solar farm. I think that stuff can help on the margins. I think there'll always be people who just object to it, and governments and sort of need to make the decision and make the leap and get this stuff built. But I think there's smarter ways to do it that sort of reduces some of the best faith objections to this. Andy Perry, problem by accepting gas stoves, leave the gas infrastructure in place. Yeah, you're telling me. Yeah, that's true. I totally agree. That's the downside. And correct. I don't disagree. Yeah, and right. There was, and to be clear, like, it wasn't just me making this political determination. Like, it was done in conversation with legislators and what they got comfortable with. And so I've spent too much time in government, so I'm an incorrigible half a loaf guy, where I'll just like, fine, let's take it, it's better than the status quo, let's take it and go. But I do think it's the sort of tough questions and balances to be struck. Yeah, Valdi, thanks for the questions, those were great.
Do you know if restaurants, if there's a way to alleviate their fear about giving up on gas? Like, I'm thinking of immediately like a wok. Woks are, every wok I've seen that's in a restaurant is heated by gas. I mean, is there such a thing as an induction wok?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. There was this was something that actually came up very specifically, pointedly on this question. Peter Koo, who It represents Flushing here in the 5 boroughs. It's probably a more moderate member of the city council, but he's Chinese American and represents a lot of Chinese restaurants and very specific. And is on the small business committee and very specifically was like, don't mess with my walks. Like this is really important to me and my constituents. There is the short answer is like, yes, there are like induction electric walks, and there's like an influencer on Instagram, I'm forgetting his name, on TikTok, and he like shows everybody how to do it. And like, they're definitely technological solutions or things that people can get excited about. I do think it's a big, learning curve. And as I sort of was saying, like nothing is better than actually having an appealing, better product, right? Like I think induction stoves have gotten good enough that they're genuinely like cool and exciting to be able to cook on them, and they're like obviously a better product than a lot of the gas stoves. And I think electric woks is a similar dynamic. One thing that I spoke with Andrew Ridgey, who's the head of the Restaurant Association here in New York, and is big major lobbying voice against including restaurants in this, was there is a segment of the restaurant community that voluntarily is embracing induction cooking for environmental reasons, to sort of try to be leaders in this space, and trying to elevate those voices and getting them out there talking to their fellow chefs and kitchen managers about how it's not just a good thing to do, but actually has a lot of advantages in managing a big commercial kitchen. One thing that is an argument would have loved to make more forcefully, is just about the employee worker health benefits of shifting to induction stoves in kitchens. Obviously, like if you're a cook and you're working in a commercial kitchen, you spend a lot of time behind those stoves in hopefully pretty well ventilated, but not always so well ventilated rooms with burning methane, and that's not so great. But if you can shift towards induction stoves, that can be a big improvement. So getting that message out and shifting, it's certainly possible that the city council could revisit this again and sort of try to shift this. But that's where we got to was it didn't include restaurants on the mandate.
It could improve comfort for whoever's doing the cooking too, because all of the energy goes into the pot, and only a much smaller amount radiates back into the airspace. So if you're sweating 8 hours a day over an open gas flame, multi-burner gas stove,
Totally.
if you switch to induction, you're going to be feeling a lot better, a lot cooler.
Yeah.
You're not going to be dripping sweat into what you're cooking, theoretically. And like you said, less problem with fumes, nitrous oxide being created from the burning process is going to go away. Less chance of asthma being aggravated if somebody already has asthma and they happen to be cooking. So there's lots of benefits. So if restaurant owners are talked to about this, they might be convincible, because the other argument that you talked about earlier, if they're going to be one of the few businesses left that have a gas, natural gas hookup, and that gas becomes super expensive, or maybe the company decides to, goes bankrupt, and they are not even going to supply natural gas anymore, they're going to have to make this transition sooner or later anyhow.
I wouldn't be surprised as we sort of see this next generation of electric buildings get built in the 5 boroughs, that developers of buildings that are planning to have a restaurant space in them, because it feels a little bit silly to do a whole gas system just for the stoves, might talk to their restaurant tenants and say, hey, how much do you actually need this? And I think we'll see a dynamic where a lot of developers voluntarily will just say like, hey, you're going to be fine. This is a great new restaurant space. Induction stoves and ovens will not put you out of business. It'll be way less expensive for me. Maybe I can give you a cut on the lease if you agree not to make me build a gas line just for you. Like, I think you could see some of this. So, that might be me spinning myself of having to having negotiated this exemption, but I think it's possible we'd see this too. Kevin, yeah.
Yeah. Has any national organization considered donating or convincing TV cooking shows to use an induction oven to get people used to seeing it? And
It's so smart. And I think Rachel Ray was out there like talking about how much she liked her induction. So I don't know what, there's not one at the top of my mind that's done it, but it's a brilliant idea. And I think a lot more, you know, I mean, you talk to your median thoughtful television star chef, and they're like pretty progressive people who care about climate change, and you know, I'm sure you know have thoughts on this. You know, it's a little bit unfortunate. I think part of the reason why the gas companies really lead with the stove stuff is that there's still just a ton of public support for gas stoves, mostly because when people think of electric stoves, they think of electric coil stoves rather than induction stoves. And I was the first to acknowledge that like electric coil stoves are really not great, and I wouldn't want someone to have to cook on that if they didn't want to. But fortunately, there is induction, and it is, you know, much higher quality, and so getting, I think there's a ton of education out there, and unfortunately a ton of misinformation and intentional undermining of the law using stoves as sort of the wedge issue, even though, you know, space heating is really, you know, A through Q, A through X of a lot of the major emissions that are coming from, you know, the daily operation of a lot of these buildings.
Hey, Ben, you mentioned that there's a lot of effort going on with other areas in Cornell. I mean, your 2030 project is, I guess, tracking that, but and there was someone you mentioned who was involved with the Climate Action Council. It wasn't Bob Howarth, but do you remember who that was?
So Allison Chacharian is she is one of the two co-chairs of the agriculture.
Okay.
I should make a distinction actually. So there's the Climate Action Council. Bob Howarth is the main Cornell voice there. There's the climate impact assessment, and that is what right, the New York State Climate Impacts Assessment. Let me just make sure I'm getting that. It's Allison Chacharian, and Cornell is involved in the agriculture technical working group. Yeah, Deborah Aller is the other one.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and if you can just Google New York State Climate Impacts Assessment,
Right.
and they are hard at work. There was sort of an analogous exercise that New York City did in the Bloomberg years, and then so it started in the Bloomberg years, but then you know, is re-upped every 4 or 6 years, and it's basically, it's like, what does climate change mean for our region, our economy, and what are all the things that we can anticipate using the best available science, and so that's sort of the exercise that's going on for New York State, to sort of synthesize and bring together and bring down in the level of specificity. You know, it's very easy for climate modelers to talk on a global scale about likely aggregate impacts. It's a much more challenging exercise to talk, you know, with a lot of specificity in particular regions, but there is, you know, there's stuff we can know and stuff we can anticipate and start to plan for, particularly in like the categories of changes. I mean, something that's interesting is like, obviously on net, these changes are very harrowing, but there's lots of ways in which things will cut in a couple of different directions. Like just having warmer weather on average means sometimes a longer growing season for certain types of crops. So even if your risk of drought goes up, you also can grow a little bit longer into the shoulders of the year. And, you know, it's mostly like very odd, and there'll be a lot of changes that, you know, some of which will be very harrowing and dangerous, and some of which will mostly just need some adapting to, and shifting. But that's sort of why we look to the researchers to articulate the risks and shifts that we can anticipate.
Is anybody gathering information and compiling it and categorizing it to assess how climate change is already adversely affecting agriculture in New York State? Because
Yeah.
this seems like the general public is completely clueless about this. And all too many of our New York State legislators also appear to be clueless or pretend to be clueless about it.
Yeah.
And it's very frustrating when we try to advocate for change when these people don't seem to understand that it's already a huge problem right here in New York State. And they seem to be thinking that, you know, maybe the farmers don't want to admit it, but they understand what's happening. And some of them are maybe against the transition being forced on them. But overall, I think they want to see the problem solved in some way. So I'm wondering, how do we balance these tensions? And, you know, is there enough data so that we can provide this data to legislators?
Yeah, I mean, so Deborah Aller, who I mentioned, is she works really closely with Cornell Cooperative Extension, and I do think a lot of what this climate impacts assessment process is looking to is not just sort of, as you articulated, like the future impacts, but what is happening right now, and what negative dynamics we're already seeing can be attributed to climate change. You know, something I like a lot about Cornell is how connected it is to sort of direct farmer or agricultural community communications and education. I think it's a very credible source of a lot of information on many topics for farmers, from how to improve yields and manage their farms in a more thoughtful, productive way. And so I think incorporating honest, science-based articulations of the risks associated with climate and things that farmers can be doing to prepare or be part of the solution. I think Cornell Cooperative Extension and Cornell just generally is, because of its world-class agriculture college, is very well positioned to be able to do this in, I hope, a sort of thoughtful, credible way. So people will sort of see it as people who are looking out for their best interests, bringing them the best available knowledge to help them make decisions, as opposed to something that might be seen as more ideological or activist oriented, right? Like these are folks who have long and deep, credible relationships with communities all across the state. So that's I think something quite powerful that Cornell has, that I think a lot of other institutions that are thinking about climate change just don't really have as a strength or a resource to be thinking about. Kevin, yeah.
Yes. What's the most efficient way for a municipality to calculate its carbon footprint so that going forward they can tell whether remediation is doing anything or just or not?
Yeah. So the EPA has calculators. There's also C40 is like and there's a couple of different climate smart cities folks. But to be very plain about it, the math is literally how much gasoline do you buy, how much natural gas do you buy, how much electricity do you use, and how dirty is your grid. And those three things get at a huge fraction of the emissions associated with your municipal operations or your city. So, the less natural gas you end up burning, the less gasoline that's sold and used in your municipality or is burned in your municipal fleet, and the cleaner you can sort of say your grid is getting. That's 8/10 of your climate impact can sort of be traced back to those pieces in a in the most typical way of sort of doing the municipal or community level accounting for a lot of this stuff.
What about concrete? That's worldwide, that's a huge problem as far as generating greenhouse gases. And I've read that there's some people that are working on what appear to be breakthroughs in trying to reduce that or coming up with substitutes for it. Does Cornell have anything to do with that? Or
yeah, so there's a gentleman named Felix Heisel in the College of Architecture, Art, and Planning who does a lot of thinking about embodied emissions. People look at this in a couple of different ways, I think all of which are pretty valuable. So one is you just look at the processes for developing concrete and you think about ways to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions associated with that process. whether it's like mixing in new aggregates or changing the heat source for when you're mixing and making your concrete. Another way people think about it is just finding replacement building materials altogether. So laminated timber is a building material that I'm pretty interested in and excited about. It's something that we expanded the allowable use of it in New York City while I was working in the mayor's office. But it's essentially, an advanced wood product that has a lot of the density and fire durability and fireproof and structural integrity of sort of steel and concrete, but can be much lower embodied carbon, and sometimes even carbon neutral if you think about it in a particular way, where wood that would otherwise be going back into the atmosphere as it rots away is instead treated and used as a building material that is far more durable. So that's sort of one category. Felix Heisel's work is actually about circularity and using existing building materials and repurposing it for new buildings. So you don't need to be you don't need to be sort of creating concrete for new construction. You can be recycling a lot of existing building materials. He has this great concept that he calls the urban mine, which is like all of the existing materials that exist in a built urban system that you can be like, if you're doing demolition, rather than just demolition, sending it to landfill, you can actually be like demolishing a building and repurposing its parts for a new structure. His like very far future vision is to actually build buildings so they are easy to be disassembled and put into new buildings. So like as you grow, it's almost like Tinker Toys. You can like build a building, and then if you need to grow, you like take it apart and like put it back together in a larger thing. That's obviously a little bit over the horizon, but that's why universities are great, is you can have people thinking big ideas on longer time scales. So I think all of those sort of strategies are really helpful, sort of thinking about ways to reduce emissions from the sort of material that we know and understand, thinking about replacement materials and thinking about recycling, repurposing the already built stuff that we have.
Anybody else have any thoughts? I've got a few more, but I don't want to take up the rest of the time we have.
I'll jump in then. I have a question about basically insulation of older homes, especially in the Northeast.
Yeah.
Is there enough funding to really get that done at a pace that it needs to be done?
Yeah, I think probably the shortest answer is no. I do think, however, that for a lot of the home construction challenges, money is really just sort of the first step. And a lot of the limitations and challenges are non-monetary. So even if there's a ton of incentives available or financing available for home improvements, it's tough to schedule. People don't really prioritize getting their act together to insulate their homes if there's not a sort of immediate energy savings. Of all the things that people are investing in to improve their home, insulation isn't always at the top of their list. And it's disruptive to like have a lot of home work happening and getting a contractor, getting a quote, figuring out what incentives are available, right? So I think it's a combination of some resources are available. I think there's more coming through the Inflation Reduction Act, but then also making the case in a more systematic way to homeowners and building owners that it's a worthwhile investment. I mentioned Local Law 97, which is the major targets for existing buildings. So for large buildings in the state of New York, or in New York City rather. I think one of the goals of that is not just to encourage electrification, but also to dramatically create a pretty strong incentive for people to be investing in efficiency too. I think absent some type of requirement or penalty associated with not doing it, it's hard to get people to proactively go out there and do it unless there's really an obvious very large benefit to make it worth not just the money but the hassle. Is how I would think about it.
Thanks.
Yeah.
One thing that popped into my head that I heard within the last week, I think it was on National Public Radio broadcast, they mentioned that Ithaca has long had for many years now a car share program.
Yeah.
And something that you wouldn't think of, but this is potentially going to be left high and dry because the insurance carrier is getting ready to drop the insurance. And if they don't find somebody else to take up the provision of insurance for this type of thing, which isn't commonly understood by most major insurance companies, they won't be able to afford to
I didn't
keep
know that.
running
That's
this.
terrible. I'm a big fan of Ithaca Car Share. That really is unfortunate. I didn't know they were struggling with that. Yeah, I mean, I don't know the details of that particular situation, but I do think, thinking about ways we can be, reducing the amount of trips that are taken in a personal vehicle, thinking about ways to share vehicles, all that stuff is terrific. I didn't talk so much about it, but another big chunk of work that I did when I was with the city is, expanding non-car options, building out bike lanes and safer pedestrian streets, helping improve transit service. New York City is obviously starting from a very different built reality than a lot of other communities across the state, where we have a subway system, we have an incredible bus system. Many people live lives without owning their own car, and so we're sort of improving those systems is much easier than trying to build them from scratch in a community across the state. But in a place like Ithaca, where making it easier to have an electric car, making it easier for people to have one car instead of two cars, making it easier for people, all of these sort of like shifts can be really beneficial. It would be a real shame if Ithaca Car Share didn't work. Their structure is a nonprofit. I wonder if there's things that are interesting about that, and they obviously compete with rental car companies and some of the other bigger named for-profit in a not so long ago sort of venture funded, Silicon Valley pouring money into a lot of things like this, losing a lot of money also, but at least for a little while it was fun to have a bunch of wealthy people in Silicon Valley giving us subsidized rides everywhere. But I think that's sort of come to an end. But yeah.
I don't know if this will be a replacement for car shares, but do you know about the SkyPod proposal?
Oh, I
with
saw this.
Ithaca?
Yeah. I mean, I like big fun ideas like that. I always wonder how much you're actually able to replace a lot of the trips that people actually take every day or want to take. But every little bit helps. And if you can, particularly if you can sort of shift allow more residential development to happen along a route like that, so many more people can sort of rely on something like that for a lot more of their trips, or maybe not need to own a car. That can be very, very positive. Elliot asked a question: how much does it cost to convert a house to electric? It varies widely. If you're building a new building, it's entirely sort of costs competitive, and maybe sometimes even a little bit less expensive because you don't have to build a natural gas system as part of your building. The retrofits, I mean, it can be tens of thousands of dollars, 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, depending on how much work it needs to get done. A lot of it, some technologies that I'm increasingly interested in are sort of heat pump window units that can get you a long way towards reducing the need to use your boiler, and dramatically reduce the amount of gas that you use, even if you still use it on some occasional cold nights. Again, it's one of these questions of, obviously it's best if you can fully detach yourself from the gas system, but you can use a lot less gas. If something 1/5 the cost can get you 80% of the way there, that's like an appealing option for a lot of people, and way better than doing nothing at all. But again, Elliot, like one of the things that I'm hoping to see with the Inflation Reduction Act, I think a lot of the costs right now are being driven by heat pumps themselves. I think are coming down in cost. I think a big challenge is the contractor community isn't used to doing these jobs or installing them. So there's a little bit less of like a plug and play standard operating procedure way that they do it. So it's incredible right now, at least it's like pretty customized according to the individual building. And you really need to shop around to find someone who can really do it. Which is why I think we started, and the state is looking to start with new buildings, right? We're not talking like, we want to encourage and make it as economical as possible for people to make these shifts. But when it comes to when you're constructing a new structure, it should really be an electric one. Yeah, Baldy.
One big thing that New York State, as well as other states and countries around the planet, are wrestling with is how to fund the transition. The problem that we're facing is we've got a bump to get over in terms of the cost to change out all of this infrastructure that we already have that's related to energy usage. Even though in the long run, we're going to be saving money, some of that savings is in other places that people don't necessarily associate with what's happening, and their minds are not wired to think about all the deaths that we're having from just the air pollution from fossil fuels alone, and the diseases that we're paying for in terms of the public from fossil fuel air and water pollution. How do we get people to accept this short-term increase in possibly taxes, creative funding ideas, like New York State is wrestling with the idea of taxing historical polluters for a certain time frame in the past, and assessing companies that still exist that created this pollution and X amount of dollars per ton of equivalent CO2 greenhouse gas emissions. And then also they're wrestling with putting in a fee related to a cap on how much emissions can be emitted in the future from now on. And people are worried that this is going to raise prices of people that are currently using fossil fuel related energy. And then there's talk about providing funding back in terms of rebates to lower and moderate income people. And the problem is that this is very complicated. Just me explaining this simply is taking time.
Yeah.
And to get this across to people so that they understand it and so they're not afraid of it. Number one, how easy is it to have this happen and to write it into law so that it's effective and enforceable? And number two, how easy is it to convince the public and therefore have them put pressure on their legislators to actually make it happen? Because this is the critical year to make this happen. And I'm afraid that this might not happen in New York State.
Yeah.
And if we don't have it happen, people are going to say, hey, New York State, they're the ones that were claiming they were going to be leaders. And if they fail, people are going to laugh at us and say, see, even New York State couldn't do it.
Yeah. I think it's very challenging. I do think that, not to add even another layer of complexity and challenge, but I've sort of indicated this a couple of different times. Like I do think having money is sort of just the first challenging step. And, you know, when people making sure that as the resources do become available to do this type of work, and, you know, I think there's lots of different ways to thoughtfully do it, whether it's sort of this super fund for climate polluters concept, or sort of something like a cap and invest, or even, I mean, even just the fact that there's a huge amount of money now coming from the Inflation Reduction Act, I think is a very different dynamic than was the case even, you know, a couple of years ago. But I think for all of us who care so deeply about climate, like making sure that that money turns into real projects and real change is actually a pretty challenging dynamic, and one that's, I think, even more than having the critical will to like have the legislature write a big set of checks, but to actually like transform buildings, transform transportation systems, transform our energy system. Getting that work done with the resources that are available in a sort of thoughtful and efficient way is also going to be really critical. And I think is something that a lot of us who care so much about this issue, it really behooves us to focus a lot on that. Andy, I think this can be the last question. It's a very good one. You know, I also don't like to think about GDP at all, actually. I actually think about sort of like structures and how we all live, which doesn't actually make the problem easier. I find it very hard and also extremely hard. So I think about all the different homes that all of us in New York currently have, and all of our kids when they grow up they'll want to have while we're still alive, and all the people who might want to move to New York. And I think about where they'll live, and I think about how those places stay warm in the winter, and I think about how those people get around, and I think about how those people cook their food, and I think about the kind of lives that I think that those people deserve to live, and I think about all the energy that we use to provide that. And I'm sort of like deeply cognizant that that's an enormous amount of fossil fuels and a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, is sort of thinking about all of those different systems that people who we love and know deserve to have. And then I think about all the people in parts of the world that, you know, aren't as lucky as we are to have, you know, nice houses that are comfortable when it's cold and cool when it's sunny, or, you know, sunny and warm. So, you know, I agree with you that GDP is a very flawed metric, but it's almost just as daunting to think about just the factual, substantive realities of how all of us are gonna live. Not to end on a heroin. That's sort of how I think about it, because I think it is a really tricky, tough question, but sort of the stuff of this work.
Okay, well, Valdi's muted again, but hey, there he goes.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Ben, for providing that excellent summary presentation. You pointed out a lot of interesting things that are happening and that we need to think about, and the discussion was excellent. Thank you for everybody that offered comments, questions, and for just joining us and listening and for caring.